Hello everyone, and good morning. Thanks for joining us for this webinar. My name is Thomas Michael. I will be your presenter for today. And today's session topic is how to use the Asset History Sheet report. This session is going to take about maybe 30 to 45 minutes tops. And we're recording this session, so at the end of this we'll put it up on our web server and we'll send you an email when it's ready. That way you can view the session again and maybe share it with your co-workers. We have a pretty big crowd today. We had lots of registrations. We actually sold out this event, or not sold out, it's a complimentary webinar, but we had over 100 registrations. So we'll give it another minute or so for people to join in, and then we're going to get started. Also, in your webinar control panel, there's a section where you can enter questions. So if you have any questions during the session, feel free to enter them there. I'll try to answer them as I go along, but I might not get to it, but we'll follow up with an email for any questions that you may have. And having said that, let's get started with this session. The agenda for today, I'll give you a quick overview of the Asset History Sheet report, why it's so important to talk about it. And we want to focus today on the end user side for this report. So we want to understand how do you actually run this report, how do you make the most out of this report for your particular business. We'll talk about the selection screen. It's a pretty lengthy selection screen, has some very unique features. And then we'll look at the report output. So what does the report actually look like? What does it do for us? What values does it contain? How can we use this for our business? And then I'll talk about some of the limitations of that standard report. It's a great report, but there are certain limitations and you need to be aware of those. And then I'll show you a report enhancement that we have done to overcome those limitations. So let's take a look at the overview. The Asset History Sheet report, or some people refer to it as the roll forward report because it rolls forward asset values from the beginning to the end of a reporting period, can be accessed through the regular reporting tree for asset accounting. Here's the menu path. I'll also put the transaction code right there and the technical reporting name, if you need that. The report is very unique because it combines a balance-based report together with a transaction-based report. So what I mean by that is the report shows certain values or balances as of a particular reporting date, and it also shows transactions during a particular reporting time frame. That's very unique, that no other report in asset accounting can actually do that. Reports typically are only balance-based or they're only transaction-based, but they're not both. The Asset History Sheet report is the only one that can actually do that. Also, it's a pretty big report as far as what values goes. You can have up to 8 columns and 10 lines for this report. That means you can have up to 80 value fields on this report. So this makes it a really big and very comprehensive report. Now, the Asset History Sheet report really is the most powerful report we have in asset accounting. And the reason is that you can configure the logic of the report and the layout of it. So based on your own company's requirements, you can modify the layout of the report, and most importantly, you get to determine the logic of the report. You get to determine what values do you want to see where, and how do you want to consider these values for the report. Now, it's very, very important to understand that the report must be started with something called an asset history sheet version. This asset history sheet version contains the logic and the layout that you want to set. This has to be set up in configuration, so this must be configured correctly. Now, SAP delivers a couple of sample history sheet versions that you can use, but they're not necessarily good for you to use. They may not fulfill your particular reporting requirements, and I'll show you why that is in just a second. Now, this asset history sheet version determines a lot of important settings. Most importantly, the report layout. So how many columns do you have? How many rows do you have? And what values goes into each one of these columns and rows. So again, you get to decide what value you want to put in which one of these reporting buckets or value fields. And you also get to decide if you want to leave certain values out of the report. That's possible too. You can say, you know what? These certain transactions, there were one-off transactions. I don't want to include them in the report for whatever reason. That's absolutely possible. Now, the history sheet version also determines if the report is complete or not. Obviously, if you leave certain values out of it, it wouldn't be a complete report because there'd be values missing. So it's a very important thing to create a history sheet version really that includes all the values if you want a complete and comprehensive view of all of your asset values. So again, this asset history sheet version is very, very important because that determines how the values will show up on your report and what the report actually looks like. You know, what columns are included, what rows are included. Now, let's take a look at the selection screen of this report. When you start the report, the first thing you see is this, a pretty standard selection screen that looks just like all of the other asset report selection screens. One interesting feature to note right here is that highlighted button. Those are the dynamic selections, and if you haven't worked with them, take a look at them in your system. It's a very neat feature. It allows you to pull in almost any master record field from an asset master record and use it as a selection criteria. And I say almost any field. There's a couple of limitations, a couple of fields you can't pull in. But for example, if you wanted to use the evaluation group fields as a selection criteria for the report, they're not on the standard selection screen that you see right here, but you can click on the dynamic selections and you can pull that field in and use it in your asset report. And that's called the dynamic selections. Now, if I scroll down on the on the selection screen, I get to the settings section, and this is where you see you put in your reporting date. And you notice that there's no from date, there's only a to date, that's the reporting date, because the from date for this report is always the beginning of the fiscal year. So that means you can only run this report on a year-to-date basis. So it will always, if you're on a normal calendar year, it will always start on January 1st through whatever date you put in here. So it will always be a year-to-date report. A couple of the other fields right here on the settings are pretty important, obviously. You can put in the depreciation area, so you can run this report for any purpose. It could be for financial book purposes or for tax purposes. You can run it on the tax area, really any depreciation area that you want. And also, and this is an important setting, unfortunately most of my clients or most of the people I work with don't spend enough time selecting a sort version. The sort version is really important because it determines what ultimately your report and your values look like. So, for example, if you want to run the report and you want to have a subtotal for every cost center, well, you need to make sure that you pick a sort version that includes cost center as a subtotal level. So don't always accept that default sort version 001. It's probably not one of the better sort versions. You know, spend the extra minute and pick the right sort version that you really want. So again, remember that any field that you want to see on the report, for example, the cost center or the asset class, and if you want a subtotal for those fields, make sure that field is actually included in the sort version that you pick. And also you can enter a translation method right here. That's another interesting feature of this report. It allows you to run the report in any currency using a variety of translation or exchange rate dates. So even though your depreciation area 01 might be in US dollars, if you want to run this report in euros, you can do that simply by entering a translation method, and the system will do the currency translation for you automatically. Now if I keep scrolling down, I'm still on the selection screen, so it's a pretty long selection screen. Here are a couple of the other settings. The top one here, also very important, use ALV grid. ALV stands for Advanced List Viewer. And if you've ever seen the classic reports, you'll probably know that there'll be multiple lines for each asset record. So one asset record might have 3 lines of values below it, and if you try to export that to Excel, it makes it very, very cumbersome to work with. If you don't want this, make sure that you click on ALV grid, because then the report layout in SAP changes and it will give you one asset master record and all of the values for it in one row. So now that you can download into Excel very easily, and you have one row for each asset master record, and you can now analyze it and work with further. That's what that ALV option does. And I'll show you the report output in just a little bit with both options, with ALV and without ALV. And then most importantly, we get to the history sheet version. That's the thing that I mentioned just a minute ago. Unfortunately, it's pretty much towards the bottom of the selection screen. I wish it would be on top so that people realized how important this is. The report defaults with a history sheet version 001. That's one of the standard SAP examples. That's not necessarily the best version to use, and again, I'll show you why in just a second. Just remember right now that the history sheet version contains the layout of your report and also the reporting logic, the values. So that's why it's very important to pick the right history sheet version before you run that report. And then last but not least, you can run the report for planned values, planned depreciation amounts, or actually posted depreciation amounts. So that makes a big difference too. If you want to use this report to reconcile to the general ledger, for example, always make sure that you click on posted depreciation. Okay, so that's the selection screen. Again, it's pretty long. There's quite a few fields on it, and I highlighted the most important ones right here. Now let's take a look at the report output. So once I run this report, what does it actually look like? Well, before we do that, let's take a quick poll around the room. I'd like to see, let me see if I can start this poll real quick. There we go. Now you can enter your poll answer. Question is, does your company have a custom asset history sheet version configured? The answers are no. We're using SAP's sample version, maybe that 001 that I've just shown you. Or maybe you're not sure, that's okay. Or yes, we have our own custom asset history sheet version. It would be very interesting to see what it is around the room. I'll give you guys a few more seconds. About 70% voted, 75%. Keep going, and then I'll share those results. So again, question is, do you have a custom asset history sheet version set up, or do you really use the standard SAP examples? And we're almost done voting here. And I see that 35% of you have their own version set up. That's very good. Pat yourself on the back. About 30% of you are not really sure, so that's important. Whenever you run that report next time, take a look at that field and really double check what you have been running it for and what version you have been using. And about 38%, 40% says, no, we don't have our own version. We use SAP's sample versions. So let me show you what that actually does. So let's go past this here. Now this is what the report looks like when I run this. And let's pay attention to the header, that red box on top. And it might be a little small, so I'm going to zoom in right here. So the header says, in compliance with EC European Community, in compliance with European Community Directive number 4. Well, that's European GAAP accounting rules. That has nothing to do with US GAAP accounting rules. In fact, they're quite different, especially when it comes to how we account for asset acquisitions versus asset transfers. In Europe, they're doing it very, very differently than we do it here in the US. So if you run this report with that standard SAP sample 0001, this is what you're getting. You're running this report based on European GAAP accounting rules. And you may have already realized that you have some problems reconciling your acquisitions to the whatever number it is on the report versus your transfers. Certain things that you consider an acquisition show up under transfers and vice versa. And that's a direct result of not using the correct asset history sheet version. The other important thing to notice, look at the far right. It says incomplete. Now this indicates that this asset history sheet version here is in fact incomplete. There are certain asset transactions that are not represented on this report. They're being left out. So when I see this, I don't know what transactions are being left out, and I can't tell if this is a complete picture of my asset accounting system. So we all know that auditors are getting smarter these days, and they understand this. So any auditor that understands assets and looks for this report will look at the header first to see, you know, what accounting principle are we using here, and this is even a complete report. And if it says incomplete, if I were an auditor, I would reject this report. I would say I can't use this report because it specifically says it's incomplete. So this incomplete, by the way, it comes from the configuration of the asset history sheet version. So in config right there, you can tell the system what transactions to include and which ones to leave out. And of course, if you leave certain transactions out, SAP will flag this version automatically as being incomplete. So the only way to make it complete is to go back to the configuration and include whatever missing transactions you have. But let's take a look at the actual report now, the output. So the report starts on the left side in that red box with the beginning values. So remember, those are the values as of the beginning of the fiscal year. I don't get to pick as of when I want to see those values. SAP will always show me the values as of the beginning of the fiscal year. So if I'm on a calendar year, these are my values as of 1/1 of the year. And typically what I see here is I see the APC fiscal year start. APC is acquisition and production cost. Right below it, I have the depreciation as of the fiscal year start. And then just below that, I have the book value or net book value as of the fiscal year start. Now over on the right side, I have the ending values. Right, left side beginning values, right side ending values. Now the ending values are always as of the reporting date. So whatever reporting date I entered on the selection screen, if I enter 12/31 of 2011, the values are shown as of that date. Remember what I said, that the report combines balance-based and transaction-based reports? Well, here are two balance-based values, right? The beginning of the year and the ending of the year. So these are the balances as of two key dates. And then in the middle, between those values, I have all my transactions that occurred between those two dates, beginning of the year and my reporting date. So this is my transactional, those are my transaction values. Now remember that the entire layout of this report is determined by whatever history sheet version you use. And I can freely define that layout in configuration. When we work with clients and we set up custom history sheet versions, obviously we don't use the SAP examples for the problems that I just mentioned. We create our own versions based on the client's requirements. The typical layout is always the same. You have the beginning values, then you have your acquisitions, you take out your retirements, then you have transfers, and then you have anything else, right? So if you're not an acquisition or a retirement or a transfer, you must be another adjustment. And if I add it all up, I get to my ending values. Now we've worked with clients for the last 15 years and created hundreds of these versions. A lot of people, for example, on this sample that you see here over on the right side, you see two columns. One is called post capitalization, and then there's a separate column for it, investment support. Those are so rare that we would typically merge these two columns together and simply call this other adjustments. So again, if you're not an acquisition, you're not a retirement, you're not a transfer, then you must be another adjustment, and we typically put these in one single column. Just recently we had a client that went through a revaluation of their assets, and they asked if we can display the revaluation amounts, the postings for revaluations, in a separate column. And sure, we can. So we simply added another column to the report layout, called it revaluations, and we're showing those revaluation postings in their own separate column. Other clients, another thing that we always do, you see where it says transfer right in the middle? There's a transfer column. We typically split that out into intra-company transfers within the same company code, versus inter-company transfers, so transfers between company codes. It just gives you a little more transparency when it comes to analyzing your assets. You could even take it further. You can split out the inter-company transfers, again, into transfers in versus transfers out. You could do that too. Then you see how much money was transferred into my company code versus how much money was transferred out. Other columns that we sometimes add are CIP, in versus out amounts. So we had a client that wanted to see the net flow of money in his CIP account, so we created two separate columns. CIP in, that showed the monthly settlements that were made into the CIP account, versus a CIP out column, which shows the monthly amounts that were placed in service into the final asset. So you would see money coming into CIP, so this is fresh new capital spending that's sitting in CIP, and then you see money that's going out of CIP because it's being placed in service, and it would show up under the acquisition column for the final assets. So again, you can do a lot of things with this layout. You're totally free to do whatever you want to do based on your own company reporting requirements. And before we move on, take a look at this layout, by the way. This is the classical display of the report. Notice that for each asset, there's actually 4 rows, right? There's the pink or orange colored row with the asset number and asset description, followed by 3 rows just below it with the asset values. Now if I try to export this into Excel, it comes over just like that. So that's very ugly and very hard for me to work with or sort it, subtotal it. So this classical display is not what we typically want to use. We want to switch over to that ALV display, and I'll show you that in just a minute. Now let's take a look at the values. So right there, I ran this report for planned depreciation values, and I see that this particular asset shows it has a planned amount of $6,242. That's for the reporting time frame year to date. Now if I go into the Asset Explorer and pull up that Asset Master record, I can click on the Planned Values tab and I see that exact same amount right there. So it's very easy for me to look at the asset history sheet and look at an individual asset and tie those numbers out. But remember, those are planned values. I can also go back into the selection screen and I can say, I don't want to see planned values, I want to see posted values. It makes a big difference. So I run the exact same report for the exact same time frame. The only thing that I do is I turn on posted depreciation and I run the report again. And in the header, it now indicates that this report shows posted depreciation as opposed to planned depreciation. Again, very important to look at the header whenever you see a report to understand what am I looking at here. Am I looking at planned values or posted values? And now here's the asset again, and my depreciation for the year just went from $6,000 down to 0. So what happened to my depreciation? Where did it go? Well, the answer obviously is I'm looking at posted values, and if it says 0, that means that depreciation hasn't been posted yet. I can also tie that back to the Asset Explorer. So if I go back here and I click on that Posted Values tab, I now see the depreciation amounts for this asset for each period, and I see the status, and I see that, yep, it's all planned, it hasn't actually been posted yet. And that's the reason why the report showed me $0. So again, makes it very easy to tie back to an individual asset. So we looked at the selection screen for the report, understand how to run this. We looked at the report output, we understand what it contains, what drives the look and the layout of the report. Now let's look at a couple of the limitations. I mentioned that this is the most powerful report in asset accounting, and it's one of my favorite reports, definitely. But it has some serious limitations. You already saw that you can only run this report on a year-to-date basis. That means I can't run it just for a single month. I can't run it for the current month. I can't run it for the month of March. So if I want to use this report to reconcile to my general ledger for March, I really can't. I can't get this report to tell me what are the beginning values of March, all of the activity of March, and the ending balances. What I would have to do is I would have to run it twice. I would have to run it with an end of February date, and then again with an end of March date. Now I have to export both of these reports into Excel and subtract one from the other, so it's very cumbersome, obviously not something that I want to do. So unfortunately, that's a big shortcoming of this report, that I cannot run this for any individual period. I can't run it for a single month or a range of months, so I can't run it for the second quarter of this year either. Also, I can't run this report for prior years, closed years, with a date, any other date than the year-end date. So for 2010, obviously that's closed already in my system. I can only go back and run this for 12/31 of 2010. I can't use any other reporting date. So if I wanted to run this for September of last year, I can't. It doesn't allow it. It only allows me to enter the last day of the fiscal year. So that's a very, very big shortcoming. I can't even do this workaround where I run it for 1 month and then I run it again for the next month and subtract the two. It won't allow it for prior years. It only allows 12/31. So if you think back about the selection screen, you remember there's only one report date I enter right here. I can't put in a from period. I can only put in a to period. Right? And if I try to enter this date here, September 30th of 2009, I'm going to get a hard error message. It says this report date is invalid because 2009 is already closed. Well, for the current fiscal year, that would be a valid date because the current fiscal year obviously is open. But if I try to run this for any of the prior fiscal years, it doesn't allow me to do that anymore. So that's, of course, a big problem, because if I didn't run a report last year for 9/30/2009 and downloaded it, well, I can't regenerate it. I can't create it. So obviously, big problem. A lot of our clients came to us and complained about it. Says, I wish there was a solution, and guess what? There is. We created a reporting enhancement for this, and with our enhancement, we solve all these problems. So with our custom report, you can run it for any period in any open or even closed fiscal year. You don't have to run it on a year-to-date basis. You run it on a period basis. And the report will not display the beginning of the year values. It actually shows you the beginning of the period values. So if I want to run this report for March of this year, it will show me the beginning values as of March 1st. I can also do that for last fiscal year. So I can run it for September of last year. I can say, give me the values as of September 1st through September 30th. Now, even though that year is already closed, that allows me to do that. When you install our enhancement, everything looks exactly the same. Everything works exactly the same as the standard report. The only difference that you will notice is on the selection screen. Right there, we normally put the reporting date in there. We took that out and we replaced it with a from and to period and a fiscal year. So now, again, I can put in any single period or range of periods for any open or closed fiscal year. That's the only difference that you see when you run this report. All the magic happens in the background. And everything else is standard. So it will still work with the same asset history sheet versions that you have. It uses the same sort version, selection criteria. Everything else is the same. You can still download it to Excel, sort, subtotal it any way you want to. The only thing that we changed is the logic in the background that allows you to run it on a period basis. Now when I run this report, and this time I ran this report with the ALV option turned on, to notice how every asset now shows up in a single row and all the values are in a single row, so I can now easily export this into Excel simply by clicking on that Excel button on top there. So that's why you always want to run this with an ALV option turned on. But yeah, so when you run this, this is our custom report right here, and you'll notice that it actually indicates on top that this is now based on periods as opposed to year-to-date. And I ran this report for periods 3 through 5. So, and the values that I see here, those 3 columns, they're not as of the beginning of the fiscal year like the standard would display. They're actually as of the beginning of the selected period. In my case, this is period 3. So these are March 1st values. Okay. Now, I can now run this report and use it very easily to reconcile to the general ledger. So for example, I can just go into an account balance display and I pull up the plant and equipment account right here, and I see in period 1 this account was debited for $1,024,000. So now I can run my report very easily just for that single period, and I see, oh yep, there's an acquisition posted for $1,024,000. So if I use this report and simply use a sort version that sorts and subtotals by GL account, I can reconcile the subledger to the general ledger in 10 minutes. It makes it so easy. So this is one of the great features or purposes of this particular report. So again, our report enhancement, you can make the GL reconciliation super fast and easy. You simply run the report, sort it and subtotal it by GL account, and you can compare it straight into the balance sheet display. You can run it for any period, any range of period, for open or closed fiscal years. And best of all, you install this whole thing, or any ABAPer can install this enhancement in 30 minutes or less. If you want to see a demo of this particular enhancement, you can go to our website, click on that link, or you can also contact our sales team and they'll help you with that. Okay, then in summary, we understand now that the asset history sheet report is the most powerful report we have available in asset accounting. We also understand that we have to have an asset history sheet version, and it must be configured according to our requirements. We should not be using those sample SAP versions just because they don't necessarily fit our accounting standards, and they may not be complete. So we really need to spend the time and define a version for ourselves, and that's not a big deal. You can do that in configuration in a matter of a few hours. Also, the asset history sheet report shows me the beginning and ending values for the reporting time frame, and in between it shows me all of the asset activity that occurred during that time frame. That's why it's a balance-based and also transactional-based report combined together. Makes it very unique. The standard report has the limitations that I cannot run it for specific periods or a range of periods. Also, if I want to run it for a prior fiscal year, I can't do that. I can only use 12/31, or the last day of the fiscal year, as my reporting date. So if I forgot to run this report and download it for a period of last year, there's nothing you can do unless you get our reporting enhancement. With our enhancement, you can actually do all these things. We allow you to run this report for any period, any fiscal year, open or closed, doesn't matter, and any range of periods. All right, that completes our session. I hope you learned something from it. I see that we have quite a few questions. I'll get to all these questions via email and answer them. And if you have any more questions, you can send us an email right here to info@micromanagement. Again, my name is Thomas. Thank you for joining, and I hope you have a good Wednesday and a good rest of the week. Thanks, and bye-bye.